Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
Welcome back to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. I'm podcasting director Chris Mosier.
Hi, I'm Tatum Owens, Progress Texas Advocacy Associate.
Thanks for joining, Tatum. Today's conversation is part of our ongoing series with Democratic lawmakers in advance of the 2025 legislative session. What's ahead and what's at stake for our state as the second Trump administration begins. Representative Erin Zwiener of Driftwood, west of Austin, one of the youngest lawmakers at the Capitol, has a resume full of fun facts. Prior to her political life, she was a contestant on Jeopardy 4 times, winning over $53,000. She got involved with the Indivisible movement after the 2016 election cycle. She challenged Republican Jason Isaac for his seat in the Texas House while she was pregnant, won the Democratic primary that year by less than 200 votes, gave birth during the campaign, and won her election in 2018 with 51% of the vote. She served in the House since then. Representative Erin Zwiener, it's great to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
Loads of fun.
Thank you. So, Rep. Zwiener, thank you again for being here. Let's start with how you're viewing the election we've just gone through. Still recovering. We're here to talk about what's coming up, but please share your thoughts with us on what went wrong for Democrats and what the progressive side needs to adjust for the next go-round.
You know, I think we all had a lot of optimism for this election, but a lot of us were also seeing warning signs as well leading up. One thing that I think is really important for us to keep in context so that we can stay hopeful is that the fundamentals of this election were hard for Democrats. We ended up in this dynamic where people were comparing how they felt about their lives right before COVID to how they felt about them now, and putting all of the blame for COVID on the Biden administration, which just isn't, how history unfolded isn't right, but it's how people were processing it. And so we unfortunately ended up with an incredibly unpopular incumbent. And I will say this, through no fault of his own. But we ended up with a very unpopular incumbent and a lot of people voting against incumbency, not just in Texas, not just in the country, but honestly, globally. Incumbents have had terrible election results. And we ended up with a presidential candidate who was our incumbent's right-hand person. And she had a real difficult time distancing herself from that. I remember being in conversations with my colleagues where there was sort of this acknowledgement that the only way Democrats could win the presidency is if Trump was the nominee, that maybe Trump had enough baggage to lose. My position was very strong that it's not worth letting that man any closer to the presidency. And here we are again, unfortunately. But there is one other thing I do want to bring up that went wrong in this election that I think we need to be aware of. One is we've got to marry our social messaging and our economic messaging. Both things are important. And when people feel economically precarious, they are more vulnerable to some of these moral panics that we see the right trying to make happen again and again. So we were right to talk about our social issues, particularly issues like abortion that are overwhelmingly, the Democratic position, the progressive position is popular. We were right to talk about that, but we can't neglect the economic side, and I don't think we had a strong enough message there. The other big message, and this I'm carrying upwards, it's not for the everyday voter, everyday activist, but we have got to quit trying to invest money into these C3s and C4s that can't say the word Democrat and can't say candidates' names. There's this idea that we'll send these groups out just to register voters, and by virtue of the demographics of these groups, they will vote for Democrats. And we have to talk about our messaging to everybody. We have to talk about our messaging to working class voters. We have to talk about our messaging to low propensity Hispanic voters. We have to talk about our messaging to young voters. Where I see that most acutely in my district is at Texas State. You have a very young electorate, and they're getting pretty cynical. And they are being fed a steady diet on social media of here's why everybody's bad. And that's just not reality. The truth is Democrats and progressives are standing up every day and fighting for their values, and we need to tell them that. And if the way we message to them is through groups who aren't allowed to talk about partisanship, they're not going to get that message. And so a big message I'm carrying upwards is quit this game of these orgs that aren't officially partisan. We have got to go brand ourselves as Democrats strongly and positively with the upcoming generation.
It just so happens I know of an org that has no such limitations, and so we're super proud to have you on board with that message. And Yeah, absolutely. The refining of that messaging is something we'll talk about as we continue today. As you said, we are now in the mess that we perhaps flirted with ourselves by counting on Donald Trump to be a terrible candidate. Republicans at this point are more emboldened than they ever have been here in Texas with the Trump win. Rep. Zwiener, what do you expect in terms of the Democratic Party's overall situation in the upcoming session? And more specifically, what challenges do you personally expect to face in the next go-round here?
We're going to be in for a rough session, full stop. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick feels more empowered than ever, as does Governor Abbott. As many of y'all know, Governor Abbott went after several members of his own party and ousted them in the primary. So we really have a problem of, a top-heavy GOP leadership in this state really dictating downwards. And we do have some members of the GOP in the legislature who are still being brave and standing up to that. But that takes a toll, and they only have so much bravery. So I am expecting a tough legislative session with a lot of focus on social issues. We already know the lieutenant governor has one of his priorities is putting the 10 commandments in every school, which, to be clear, is blatantly unconstitutional, even under some of these more right-leaning recent Supreme Court decisions. So it's going to be tough, and we don't have great numbers. There's going to be 88 Republicans in the House and 62 Democrats. And there's a phrase that I learned recently from my colleague, Representative Donna Howard, that's 88, no debate. And so we as Dems are going to have to work very hard to try and mitigate damage. We're going to have to be creative on the floor. And we're going to have to be creative in our negotiating to try and, again, stem the damage as much as we can. But I don't want to mislead people. There's going to be damage. And so a lot of what we need to do is kind of this war of attrition. If you can come down to the Capitol and testify and be present and be visible, that matters. You might not stop that exact bill, but they can only push through so many bills through that sort of high intensity pressure from legislators and from our communities. So when you show up and are part of 200 people, 300 people signing up to testify on a bill, know that even if you don't stop that bill, you've stopped another bad bill from coming in right on its tails. You have used up some of their stamina to do the bad thing. And so I really talk to my constituents a lot about that because, I live 20 miles from the Capitol. We can get there. My constituents can get there and show up. And if you can get there and show up, know that that's helpful. Know that it helps us as legislators have support to do the same thing on the floor. Because if a bill's a, pardon my French, shit show in committee, they understand it's going to be a shit show on the floor, and we can better rally our members to make that a fight. So the other thing I think we as Democrats have to be thinking about all session is we have got to be talking about what's happening in that Capitol and helping voters connect these issues they care about to who they're going to vote for in 2026. One of our challenges is we meet in early 2025. We meet in the first half of 2025, and then the election is another year and a half away. And so we have to really permeate our cultural awareness of what's happening in that Capitol and who is responsible for it. That's one of the things I've been thinking a lot about because of the Florida election results. We saw 57% of people in Florida show up and vote for abortion rights. And then we saw 56% of them vote for Donald Trump, those are opposite positions. I want to be clear, opposite. And so we have got to work every single day to message and communicate. And it's one reason I'm really optimistic about our new HDC chair, Gene Wu. He is a very strong communicator, knows how to message, and we're going to put resources behind that.
100%. And I'm glad you bring up the Florida election. Our next question for you has to deal with reproductive rights. Republicans appear likely to expand their assault on Texas women by further limiting access to abortion, targeting access to life-saving abortion drugs used in miscarriage care, contraceptives, and even doing away with no-fault divorce. Where do you see that fight headed?
I'm pretty worried about the attacks on mifepristone, the abortifacient drug that gets used in elective abortions, but also gets used for women suffering a missed miscarriage, which is when the fetus is dying, but is dead or dying, but the miscarriage itself is not proceeding, which is an incredibly dangerous situation for any pregnant woman that can lead to sepsis, We've seen recent reports of Texas women who have actually died of sepsis because of that care not being provided quickly and promptly. That's the attack I'm most worried about. I'm also worried about, any further attempts to try and restrict travel, which is something that should be blatantly unconstitutional. But as many of us do, I have, waning confidence in our United States Supreme Court and even less confidence in the Fifth Circuit. So we need to be aware and fighting those things. I'm a little less worried about the no-fault divorce, but I think we need to be loud about it because there has been a consistent group pushing for this for a couple decades now. And to be honest, they're telling lies about it. This idea behind no-fault divorce is that, people need to stay together for the children. And you know what? I'm married. My husband and I have been together since 2016, and we have a 6-year-old kid. And I got to tell y'all, you feel substantially more married once you have that kid. It is not easy to split up when you have children, whether you are legally attached to each other or not. Nobody does that lightly. And those of us who have children all know that. And so I don't want to return to a world where in order to get a divorce from either, from an abusive partner or from a marriage that just isn't working anymore, you have to go prove bad things about your spouse. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is not good for the children to watch their parents fight over who was unfaithful first or who did something that technically approaches abandonment. I think Texans will loudly push back against that. So if that gets any real push in either the Senate or the House, that's one of the issues I look forward to hanging around the GOP's neck.
And you're absolutely right. Texans already have pushed back against it. You mentioned Amarillo, where voters did vote against this unconstitutional move to ban abortion across state lines,
It's interesting to see those kind of divisions of voting, like you mentioned, Rep. Zwiener, in Amarillo. Clearly, Trump carried the day huge, but also their travel ban did not pass based on, ostensibly constitutional grounds. Places in the country where abortion rights were on the ballot and won handily, while Trump also won. Perhaps a result of some degree of the results of disinformation in terms of people trusting Donald Trump on the idea that he's just going to leave it up to the states, that he himself is not specifically anti-abortion when we've seen everything he's done from Roe to stacking the court to everything else. And so, we're up against a lot there. Let's pivot to immigration here. Rep. Zwiener, how do you expect the Trump administration's promised deportation operation to play out here in Texas? What advice might you have for people living in Texas who are members of families of mixed immigration status? And what can everyday progressives, just normal people, what can we do to help and support people who may end up in the crosshairs of that operation?
I don't know if I'm in personally the best position to give advice on exactly what folks in mixed families should do, but I know there's a lot of advocacy orgs getting good information out there, whether that information is from groups like Raices or more local groups like Mano Amiga in my community. Mm-hmm. I do think that information is going to change on the fly. So I would recommend folks stay engaged with some of those local support orgs and follow them to know what's happening in your community, know whether roundups are happening in your community. One thing I will say is, there's been a lot of coverage of Governor Abbott's executive order that hospitals have to ask for the immigration status of people they are treating. That is a requirement for hospitals to do the data collection. There is utterly no requirement that the patient provide that information. So just be aware, most people in the world, and I presume there'll be more attempts to collect this data, you do not have to provide that to people. You don't have to provide it at the hospital. You don't have to provide it in most spaces in your life. So don't provide that data. Don't offer it up for the gristmill. Don't post about it in social media. I'm sure they will use data scraping things to try and identify folks. So I want to just encourage everyone, keep that information close to your chest and be aware that anybody outside of law enforcement does not have a right to ask that question of you. And law enforcement, in many situations, do not have a right to ask that question of you.
I'd say, for sure.
I think as progressives, there's, a couple things to do. There is the political aspect of all of this. And, I remember that in 2017, we had the legislative session with, the first Show Me Your Papers bill. And then we also had, the bathroom bill. And those became the rallying cries for people to come out and vote in 2018. And we flipped 12 House seats, Texas House seats. We flipped 2 state Senate seats, and we flipped 2 congressional seats here in Texas. So on the political side, we have got to do that work. We've got to make sure we're loud about what people are doing and loud about how it's extreme and hurts our neighbors and hurts our economy and hurts our communities. I think it's all of those things together. Don't leave one out. It's all of them. And then there's also that place to do direct support. So look for orgs in your community for how you can help folks who aren't citizens in your neck of the woods be safe through this administration. But again, that work is going to vary depending on where you are. And it's also probably work we shouldn't blast on social media. We should get tied into our trusted networks and do our support work there.
You connected our question on immigration to healthcare, and that actually brings us to our next point about how lately there's been a strong groundswell of widespread public and bipartisan disapproval of the for-profit health insurance industry. Texas is already dead last in healthcare coverage overall and has long neglected lower-income folks by refusing to accept expanded federal funding under Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Even that lifeline appears to be in jeopardy. What do you see coming for healthcare in Texas?
I remain concerned about the state of our access to healthcare, and we've seen costs go up across the board. It's been very interesting, this United Healthcare CEO story. I would never celebrate cold-blooded murder, but I think those of us in positions of power need to pay very careful attention at how our society feels about this. And to me, it's revealing just how angry people are at insurance companies. And I have a situation where I got completely screwed over by an insurance company with the birth of my daughter. They made a mistake where their documentation that I agreed to had the wrong maximum out of pocket. And they stuck by the one that was not on their document that I agreed to and would not pay out. And it was a difference of like $4,000 for me, which, wasn't enough to bankrupt us, but was real money. And seeing that and being like, oh, wow, I am not alone. This is most Americans now have a story either for themselves or someone they loved that really got treated badly and treated unfairly by an insurance company. And so I think that's posing a lot of challenges to us. At the state level, what we're able to regulate with healthcare is pretty limited in terms of regulating the insurance companies. But to me, it's this call to, we've had this privatizing model of healthcare. And so let me back up and say the obvious things are, we need to expand Medicaid so more folks have access to any level of coverage whatsoever. It also would drive down healthcare costs for everyone because we'd have fewer people walking into emergency rooms unable to ever pay that bill, which then gets distributed to all of us via costs. And we need to make sure that the enrollment process for Medicaid is easier because we are kicking people off who should be on Medicaid because our system, I think it just got compared to Oregon Trail by some people in the system, like the early 1980s game, just doesn't function very well. And we haven't been supporting the technological infrastructure or just the human infrastructure to make that system work well. So we need to make those systems work properly. But I think we also need to look at how much we have outsourced those systems to insurance companies. And sort of the siren song of the Reagan era that George W. Bush really leaned into too with this privatization. Privatize government services, give them out to contractors, and it'll all work better. Well, y'all, it ain't working better. We have tried it. It is not working better. Privatizing DFPS is not working better. Privatizing Medicaid is not working better. Privatizing Medicare is not working better. It turns out that when you run something through a for-profit organization who takes a profit off the top, you add costs. And so I do think we as a state should look at how we rebuild our bureaucracy. No, that used to be a bad word, but it really should not be a bad word so that we can provide those services internally instead of, again, outsourcing them to somebody who's going to skim money off the top because that is their business model. I have a father who's a physician, and we don't entirely share politics. We don't entirely diverge, but we don't entirely share. And he complains about this dynamic of navigating Medicaid all the time. And, we have different Medicaid providers for kids in different parts of the state. But if you're a subspecialist like my dad is, that means you end up accepting people from, 200, 300 miles away. So he ends up dealing with several different insurance companies, all who have different systems. It's incredibly inefficient, just the amount of support staff our physicians need to do billing. And he told me, but there's this one kind of Medicaid they get on, and then it's like really much easier to deal with things. Well, that's the Star Kids program that actually is administered more internally by the state of Texas. And that works better. That works better than this privatization.
I really think that the whole insurance debate and discussion that's come to light it really provides a great opportunity for what we've also been talking about, which is messaging across this political line and having more people understand that we have so much more in common than we have apart, which leads us to our next bit here. Congressman Greg Casar is among many folks who have been talking lately about the importance of cutting past the culture war distractions that our opponents love to throw our way and focusing instead on the fact that we're actually engaged in more of a conflict that's based on class than really anything that's left to right. With Donald Trump packing his cabinet with billionaires, the sides in that conflict appear to be, pretty well defined at this point. But in your view, Rep. Zwiener, how should everyday working Texans, regardless of our politics, regardless of our party, be viewing matters of the economy and opportunity?
We are certainly seeing that the rich keep getting richer while the middle class and below keep struggling and often keep struggling more. Opportunity is getting harder to come by. And it's very disorienting for folks because, the Dow Jones numbers and the NASDAQ index don't necessarily reflect that. And I think that was one of the challenges we really had this election cycle is a lot of the sort of raw economic numbers looked pretty good, but people still don't feel good. And, it's more than just vibes. It's people don't see good paths forward in this economy, whether it's related to housing, whether it's related to long-term stable jobs, whether it's related to healthcare. They are feeling pinched in a lot of different ways, even if they're getting by right now. It feels very precarious to them. So I think that class element is important. What I would really encourage, all of my fellow progressives to do is as you're going about your life, meet people where they are. And that's a big part of how we, avoid this culture war dynamic. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about people who actually feel in danger from whomever they're talking to. So if that's you, this doesn't apply. But it's really important when we're in a conversation and somebody says something that comes from a place of fear or ignorance, that those of us who have that capacity to engage with them, meet them where they are and engage with them instead of talking down to them. And there is this sort of, perception that Democrats are smug and talk down to folks. If you want to find a data point that proves that case, you can. You can also find plenty of data points that disprove it. But this has become the narrative. And so we've got to show up and engage with folks where they are. And this was the thing Beto O'Rourke did so well in 2018 and beyond. But 2018, when he was fresh, people received it so well. And, someone would come up and say, I got to keep my guns. That Second Amendment's important. And he'd say, hey, I don't disagree with you about the Second Amendment, but let's talk specifics. Could we meet on this? Could we meet on that? And I want to encourage everyone to take that form of dialogue to heart. If you meet someone who comes and tells you something ignorant, shoot, I had a family member be like, we can't castrate 6-year-olds. And I was like, nobody's doing that. Like, let's talk about what this, but I was like, let's talk about what this type of care actually looks like.
Right.
And instead of being like, how could you think that? Be like, let's start from the beginning. And the fact that we all know that parents are doing everything they can to take care of their kids. And what do you think it would take for you to get there where you're talking to a doctor about your kid's gender identity and what that means? What do you think? Do you think if your kid was 12 years old and really experiencing a lot of distress over going through puberty, do you think you would want your kid to be able to hit the pause button for a couple years while y'all talk to therapists, consult as a family, talk to doctors and figure out your next steps? And people can usually get to a yes. Yeah, I would like that pause button.
Right.
And be like, well, that's the care we're talking about. And that's the care that's being banned. This is a bit of a long answer, but we've got to show up and meet people where they actually are instead of, giving into this impulse. It's natural. We're angry. We're upset. Trump is president. A lot of us have a lot of very real and fair fear about that. But for us to build this society where we're more resilient to the dangers of Trumpism, we've got to build our relationships in our communities and help pull folks back from that edge, not isolate ourselves.
It's really easy for folks like us who are all dedicated to what we believe in, and all, I think have a pretty clear understanding, from an academic and fact-based sort of perspective on what we believe in. It's really easy to react in a way that someone might see as smug or might see as being talked down to. And so, yeah, the challenge is on us to manage the way we react to those kind of conversations. And like Rep. Zwiener says, not easy to do, but so important to do for us to engage people again in a way that they can where there's mutual respect in the conversation. It's not easy to do, but it's very important to do.
There was some interesting research done about the best way to fight back against being called a socialist if you were a Democrat.
Yeah.
And it wasn't to argue with anybody. It was just to show up and be a nice person that somebody couldn't think bad things about. And I want to be clear, I don't think socialist is fundamentally a bad word, but it was just be the type of person people don't want to believe bad things about, right. And then share your beliefs in the world. Go have your relationships on the PTA or, with your local Lions Club, and then, mention, yeah, of course I supported Kamala Harris. And then let people ask questions about that. I think that is a really powerful place, is to sort of earn that trust of your community and then build your politics outward from that.
Which is why it's so important that we have legislators like you who are doing that great work and building these communities, representing these important messages. Speaking of, do you have any legislative priorities we haven't spoken about today, whether that's stopping a bad bill or promoting a good one, anything that comes to mind?
My biggest priority issue is climate change. I founded the Texas Energy and Climate Caucus. We are up to 55 members, both Republican and Democratic, believe it or not. It's one of the few areas I feel like I have some hope for bipartisan. It turns out everyone likes cool technology. And if that technology just happens to be lower carbon emissions, the Republicans can roll with that. So I'm really interested, particularly in some geothermal policy right now. And we're having a lot of conversations about that in the building. My other big priority issue is just making sure our democracy works. I filed legislation again for campaign contribution limits so that our politicians are not for sale. I've also filed legislation for citizen ballot initiatives so that the people of Texas could bring forward issues they want to vote on.
How cool would that be? Wow.
I think it would be wonderful. I've gone back and forth on if I thought this was good policy, and coming back to those Florida results, they're what pushed me over the edge. And then I've also filed legislation to make sure that Texans can vote if they've moved recently. This is something I encounter a lot on a college campus where, folks may still be registered at their parents' address, but their parents' address is 300 miles away and they can't get back. If you are registered to vote in Texas, you should be able to cast a statewide ballot on election day, even if you're in a different county. A lot of folks get caught in a pinch for whatever reason when they've moved.
Yeah, I have two college kids myself, and so we've experienced those hurdles for sure. Rep. Zwiener, to close here, and as you mentioned a second ago, progressives in Texas and really across the country, those of us who are engaged and paying attention and getting involved, I think, are starting to get over the shock of the election and starting to focus forward on the task at hand. But there is still plenty of apprehension out there. Would you give us some words of encouragement for progressive folks who are a little worried about how things are going to go?
We have our playbook. Our playbook is called 2018. 2016, Donald Trump was elected. 2017, everyone who was able to tell themselves a story that he didn't really mean what he was saying saw that he meant what he was saying. And we saw historic levels of political engagement. Here in my county, in Hays County, 33,000 people voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And he won by 500 votes. In 2018, 33,000 people voted for Ted Cruz, and he lost Hays County by 11,000 votes. That is how much folks engaged once they saw the reality of what Donald Trump looks like in office. I expect we are going to see that again. A lot of folks were able to tell themselves stories about how Trump wasn't that bad and everything bad was really COVID. Well, Trump is not showing any more discretion in how he governs thus far. And I think we can expect that folks are going to be very angry, very engaged again, and Trump supporters are going to have a hard time making excuses for him. So I am expecting a 2026 where Democrats can win some races, and we need to be firing on all cylinders from now until November 2026 to make that a reality. Nothing is destiny. Everything is an opportunity. And we have to use that opportunity in order to be successful and build a better Texas and a better United States.
Absolutely. Rep. Zwiener and myself are definitely part of that bunch of Texans who were, maybe reading about politics and interested in politics, but then when Trump was elected, decided it was time to get in the trenches and do something about it. And so I agree with you, Representative, that I hope a lot of people have a similar reaction right now. And hopefully some of them are listening to this and we'll get on board for sure.
Doing the actual work of politics is the best cure for hopelessness I've found.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are feeling sad about the state of things, take that as your message to go volunteer in the political space. My campaign team, my first cycle, every time I got real grumpy, they were like, go knock on doors. You will feel better. And it's true. I mean, knowing that you are finding a way to build that better future is the best antidote to all of the negative feelings that we know the Trump administration is going to bring.
Very good. Well, this has been a great and inspiring talk. Representative Erin Zwiener of Driftwood, thank you so much for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Here at Progress Texas, we're in the business of countering the conservative disinformation machine that's largely responsible for the mess that we're in right now. But while that machine is funded by oil billionaires and tech billionaires and religious right-wing groups and more, we rely mostly on everyday Texans who value our work and share our belief that a Texas that works for everybody is the Texas that we want to live in. So we don't do subscriptions, we don't do paywalls, because we believe the message of progress is one that everyone should be able to access, learn from, and act upon, as we're talking about. So if you've become a regular listener, we could use your support. No amount is too small. Go to progresstexas.org to find out more about that. Thanks to Robert Clifford, Francis Ferguson, and Susan Stonecipher, all three of whom have joined the team lately. We also want to thank again the folks who have pitched in for our holiday fundraising parties this year. Those include Austin Kaplan, the Kaplan Law Firm, and the Brave Plaintiffs of Zorowski v. Texas, Carol Taylor, Nancy Sanders, and Mario Ramirez, CPA. We appreciate all of you very much for your valued and ongoing support. Again, progresstexas.org/donate. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks again to Rep. Zwiener. Thank you, Tatum, for joining in today. And thanks to you, dear listener, for all you do to press progress forward here in the Lone Star State. We'll see you again next time.